My name is Jeremy Hartwell, and I serve as a seasonal fire lookout for the Ridgepoint district on the northern edge of the Cascades. I've spent the past 5 years monitoring storms, spotting smoke columns, logging wind shifts, and reporting anything that might threaten the timber, the wildlife, or the people who trust this mountain to behave the way it always has. I thought I understood the rhythms up here. I thought I understood what normal meant, but tonight something changed. And I don't know how to explain it without starting from the moment I realized the mountain wasn't following its own rules anymore. It was just after 8:40 p.m. The last sweep of light from the sun had settled behind the western ridge, leaving that faint blue wash over the treetops that feels more like memory than daylight. The kind of color that tricks your eyes into thinking shapes are moving even when they're not. I had brewed my usual evening coffee, logged the wind speed, steady at 8 miles per hour, and scanned the valley with routine boredom. Everything looked quiet. Everything felt predictable. That's how it should be up here. Predictability is safety. Patterns are comfort. I stepped out onto the catwalk with my mug to check the north slope. The air was cool, sharp with the kind of clarity that only comes right before the temperature plunges. I've lived on this mountain long enough to pick up subtle cues. How animals go silent just before a storm, how the tree sways when the humidity climbs, how the radio static changes when lightning is about to roll in. But nothing tonight matched any pattern I knew. The first thing that bothered me was the wind. At 8:45 it simply stopped. Not faded, stopped. One moment the railing hummed from the breeze, and the next it felt like someone had shut off the mountain's ventilation. The air went still, too still, the kind that presses into your ears and makes you feel like you suddenly stepped inside a sealed room. Still air at night isn't rare, but this wasn't that. This felt intentional. I waited for a few seconds, listening. No branches creaking. No pine needles rustling, no owls, no insects, just silence, thick and unnatural. I set down my coffee and leaned out farther, scanning the slope below. The shadows weren't moving. Even the treetops had frozen in place, like the forest was holding its breath. My radio crackled for a moment, just enough to make me sit up. I stepped back inside the cabin, tapped the receiver, and muttered, "Ridgepoint lookout, standing by." Nothing. No response. Only a thin hiss that didn't belong to any known interference I'd heard before. It wasn't the usual atmospheric static. It sounded more like air being forced through a narrow vent somewhere far away. Controlled. Mechanical. I adjusted the frequency, listening for dispatch or for the general loop that plays during overnight hours. The hiss changed pitch slightly, then settled into a long, even tone before fading out altogether. When it disappeared, the silence in the cabin felt even heavier than outside. Something nudged at me, an instinct I couldn't ignore. I grabbed my binoculars and walked back onto the catwalk, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. The moon hadn't risen yet, so the valley was a soft black basin, barely outlined by the lingering twilight. Then I noticed it. The tree-line along the southern ridge wasn't shaped the way it had been earlier. At first I thought I was just tired, or maybe the shadows were playing tricks. But the ridge I'd scanned every night for months suddenly had a break in it. An indentation, subtle but undeniable. A section of trees that looked lower than they should be. Not cut, not burned, just shifted. I steadied the binoculars. The lenses focused, the shape sharpened. My breath caught. A whole section of forest looked as if it had sunk. The treetops dipped into a shallow curve, maybe 20 or 30 feet below where they should have stood. I blinked, checked my landmarks. 3 outcrops, 1 familiar ridge spine, and a boulder formation shaped like a crooked tooth. They all lined up perfectly, but the trees didn't. Something had altered the terrain. I lowered the binoculars and whispered, "What the hell?" The wind returned suddenly, not as a gentle breeze, but as a cool, narrow stream, the kind you feel when someone walks past you quickly in a hallway. It brushed against the right side of my neck, pushing my shirt collar slightly. I spun around instinctively. Nothing behind me, no movement, no shift in temperature after the gust passed. Came and went like breath. I stepped back inside and shut the door quietly without realizing I'd even done it. My heartbeat had kicked up, steady but elevated, like when you sense someone standing behind you even when you're alone. I told myself to calm down. Fire lookouts get spooked by much less. Strange wind patterns happen. Shadows distort. Forests settle. Ground shifts. All of these things have logical explanations. I repeated that to myself while I returned to the logbook and noted the weather at 8:56 p.m., though I hesitated before writing anything about the ridge. If something is truly out of place in terrain you've known for years, your brain resists labeling it. You want to find a rational anchor, a memory, a map detail you missed. But I hadn't missed anything. That indentation hadn't existed before sunset. When I stepped out again at 9:02, the dip in the treeline looked deeper. And that was when I realized I wasn't watching natural erosion or settling. Something was still moving. Something was lowering the ridge. Something was changing the mountain tonight. I kept the binoculars pressed to my face longer than I should have, trying to convince myself the shifting treeline was just a trick of the dark. But the more I stared, the more undeniable the movement became. The slope wasn't collapsing in a sudden landslide. It was sinking slowly, evenly, as if the entire section of forest were riding down an invisible elevator. Trees weren't breaking. Soil wasn't spilling. It was descending cleanly with silent precision. Landslides aren't silent. Erosion isn't smooth. Nothing in nature moves like that. I lowered the binoculars and forced myself to breathe in through my nose, out through my mouth. Slow, controlled, the way we're trained to when adrenaline starts making decisions for us. The cool air had a strange quality now. It felt denser, like it was passing through something unseen before reaching my face. I rubbed my eyes, leaned both hands on the railing, and listened for anything that might anchor this moment to a realistic explanation. The forest stayed unnervingly still. At 9:06 p.m., the radio clicked again, softly, like someone brushing a fingernail along the microphone grill. Just one click, subtle, intentional. It echoed in the tiny cabin behind me, and I turned, expecting to see the transmit button somehow stuck. But the radio sat untouched on the desk, its indicator light steady, exactly where I'd left it. I stepped inside, picked it up and said, "Dispatch, this is Ridgepoint Lookout. Do you copy?" Silence. I tried again, switching to our secondary frequency. Ridgepoint calling dispatch. Radio check. More silence. Then, faintly, so faintly I wondered if the sound came from the radio at all, I heard that strange narrow hiss again. Not static. It didn't waver or fluctuate. It had the quality of controlled airflow, the sound you might hear from ventilation deep inside a tunnel. It lasted for 4 seconds, for even seconds. Then it cut off clean like someone releasing a valve. I set the radio down gently. I suddenly felt watched. Not from behind or inside the cabin, but from the valley itself. An odd instinct, but strong enough that it made me step back out onto the catwalk even though every part of me wanted to close the shutters and wait for dawn. The ridge had sunk even deeper. What had been a shallow curve a few minutes earlier now dipped sharply, a dark basin in the silhouette. If I didn't know this landscape by heart, I might have assumed the mountain always had this shape. But I did know it. I'd spent too many nights drawing contour lines, memorizing skylines, calculating smoke drift paths. This change wasn't natural, and it wasn't subtle anymore. I reached for the spotlight mounted near the door. It's a bulky piece of equipment, adjustable intensity, long range, built for emergency nighttime searches. I hesitated before flicking it on. Shining a bright light into absolute darkness always feels like knocking on a door you're not sure you want opened. But I had to see. The beam cut through the valley in a clean column, sweeping across the slope until it reached the altered ridge. The moment the light touched it, I froze. The trees weren't just lower. They were tilted. Not all of them, just a handful near the center of the indentation. They leaned inward, toward the lowest point, like they were pulled slightly by some invisible force. The trunks weren't bent or snapped. They were angled as if the ground beneath them had shifted direction, but they stayed rooted. My throat tightened. That kind of displacement would require significant ground movement, enough that I should have heard cracking soil, felt tremors under the tower, or at the very least seen dust rising. But there was nothing. No sound. No dust. No geological activity of any kind. The light flickered, just once. A quick tremble in brightness, like the beam passed through a patch of warm air. But the air was cold, and controlled flickers like that usually mean interference, usually electrical. I nudged the spotlight higher, then lower, watching the beam pass across the ridge. The strange part wasn't the dip. It wasn't the leaning trees. It wasn't even the unnatural stillness. It was the fact that the light seemed to dim every time it crossed a specific section near the lowest point. A subtle dark patch that absorbed brightness instead of reflecting it. Not a structure, not a rock, not an object, just darkness. A pocket of it out of place in the night. I shut off the spotlight. Standing there in the dark, hands still on the light housing, I tried to reason it out. Could a large cavity have formed under the slope? A sinkhole? Possibly, except the mountain bedrock here is stable, not karst, and any void forming at that scale would require seismic precursors. We'd been monitoring tremors for weeks. Zero anomalies. Zero warnings. Could it be an optical illusion? Atmospheric distortion? Unlikely. The temperature gradient wasn't right. No heat sources. No inversion layers. Nothing to warp the visual field across that distance. Could be fatigue. Ice playing tricks. Stress. Darkness messing with depth perception. But the truth was simple. My gut didn't believe any of those explanations. And the gut is usually the first part of a lookout that learns when to pay attention. I checked the time. 9:14 p.m. 7 minutes. That was all the mountain had needed to shift from slightly strange to actively wrong. I stepped back into the cabin, closed the door quietly, and tried the radio again. Same static hiss, but now I thought I heard something beneath it. Not a voice. Not words. More like a distant vibration, as if machinery far underground were running at low power. Ridiculous, I told myself. This is a wilderness area. There are no mines, no industrial sites, no underground facilities, nothing that could. A dull thump rolled across the valley. It was low, soft, but unmistakable. Not thunder, not falling rock, more like pressure shifting under the earth. I held perfectly still. Another thump followed, then another. Not rhythmic, not patterned, sporadic, like slow, distant footsteps, but deeper, as if something massive were adjusting its weight far beneath the surface. I whispered, "What is happening down there?" The cabin creaked as if answering. And somewhere in the valley, somewhere near that lowering ridge, the forest shifted again, just slightly, just enough that I heard the faintest ripple of branches brushing against each other. Something was still moving. And it was moving upward now. The upward shift was subtle at first. So subtle I thought maybe it was just my breathing making the shadows sway. But when I leaned forward and held my breath completely still, the movement didn't stop. The trees along the base of the altered ridge were rising. Slowly, unevenly, like the earth beneath them was expanding in tiny pulses. Not bulging, not cracking, just lifting. I grabbed the binoculars again, pressed them to my eyes, and focused on a cluster of firs near the center. Their trunks tilted a few degrees, straightened slightly, then tilted again in the opposite direction. Almost like they were balancing on something shifting beneath the soil, trying to stay upright as the ground changed shape. No sound accompanied the movement, no popping roots, no sliding soil, no tumbling rocks. I've lived through 2 minor quakes in this region. Even the smallest tremor leaves a signature: vibrations, echoes, dust. What I was seeing now didn't resemble seismic activity in any meaningful way. It was controlled, deliberate, too clean to be natural. 9:18 p.m. I wrote the time down in the logbook reflexively, though my handwriting stuttered halfway through. My pen left a jagged line across the page before I regained control. I stared at it for a moment. That sharp stroke of ink felt like the first sign of something inside me slipping out of alignment too. The cabin suddenly felt too small. I needed air, even if the air outside felt wrong. I stepped back onto the catwalk, gripping the railing hard enough for my knuckles to ache. The valley was swallowing the moonlight now, which didn't make sense because the moon hadn't even fully risen yet. It was still low, still angled, but the slope seemed to absorb the light more than reflect it. The entire southern ridge looked darker than the rest of the landscape. A shadow forming before moonrise wasn't possible, but the dark patch didn't care about possible. The air shifted again behind me. Another thin, narrow gust brushing past my ear, like someone walking by quietly. The temperature didn't change. The air didn't swirl. It just moved in a single, quick line. Instinct made me turn. No one was there. I stepped back inside to check the temperature gauge. 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal for this altitude at night. Humidity steady. Pressure stable, though slightly lower than 2 hours earlier, which wasn't unusual. But the barometer needle ticked once. Just once. Then settled. Mechanical error? Maybe. But I just inspected the instrument last week. Everything was working perfectly then. And even if it had developed a fault since that inspection, it wouldn't move like that. Not in a single, precise tick. My heart thudded in my chest. Not fast, but deep, like each beat was trying to get my attention. I exhaled slowly, then turned back toward the catwalk. That's when the mountain growled. Not loudly, not with the drama of a landslide or the roar of a storm hitting the rock faces. It was quiet, low enough that I felt it through the railing more than I heard it. A vibration, resonant and steady. The kind you feel standing too close to industrial equipment when it switches on. The ground beneath the ridge wasn't collapsing. It was activating. I didn't write that down. Couldn't. Even thinking it felt like crossing a line into something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Instead, I scanned the slope again. The indentation was no longer a smooth dip. Its edges looked sharper now, more defined, like the ground had cracked in a subtle ring around the center. The trees there leaned inward in a clearer pattern, their angles forming a funnel shape pointing toward whatever lay beneath the soil. Then a flicker, not of light, of motion. Something at the base of the depression shifted upward in a quick, small jolt. Only a few inches, but unmistakably vertical. And then it sank back down just as quickly. A pulse. Test movement, like whatever was beneath had pushed up against the ceiling of the earth, checking how much resistance it would meet. I whispered without meaning to, "No, no, no." Another pulse, slightly stronger. This time, the treetops above it bounced upward by a noticeable margin, maybe a foot or more. The impact didn't break them. It didn't uproot them. It lifted them and set them back gently, as if the ground itself were cushioning the movement. My pulse hammered, matching the rhythm of the earth. I forced myself to turn away and grab the radio. My hand trembled as I pressed the transmit button. "This is Ridgepoint Lookout calling dispatch. I have possible terrain instability on the South Ridge. Repeat, possible terrain instability. Requesting confirmation of any seismic events." I waited. The radio hissed, soft, steady. Then, beneath the hiss, the faint vibration returned. Not a voice, not interference, more like breathing, slow, pressurized, artificial. I released the button instantly, dropping the radio onto the desk. It landed with a soft thud and rolled slightly, the antenna tapping against the wood in an uneven rhythm. I didn't pick it back up. I stepped outside again because, as terrifying as the valley had become, staying inside with that radio sound was worse. Out here, at least I could see the danger. Or try to. The ridge shifted again, this time lifting nearly 2 feet in one smooth motion. Still silent, still controlled. The depression deepened around it, forming a clearer circular outline. A perfect arc, almost too perfect for geological processes. A ring of subtle collapse surrounding a center that was rising. The shape wasn't random. It was structured. My breath fogged in the air, trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Every instinct I had screamed that I needed to call this in, log it, warn someone, anyone. But the radio wasn't responding, and even if it did, what would I say? Something underneath the mountain is moving. I couldn't bring myself to say those words out loud. I looked again through the binoculars. That's when I saw the soil at the center shift upward a third time. But this time it didn't fall back down. Kept rising. A dome forming beneath the earth. Steady, relentless, and big. The dome continued to rise, slow but unstoppable. Pushing the soil upward in a smooth arc. Dirt shifted along its sides like waves sliding off a surfacing whale. Except there was no break in the earth's surface. No tearing, no rupture. The ground didn't fight the lift. It yielded to it, stretching, thinning, conforming around the expanding shape beneath. I felt a tremor in the railing under my palms. Not enough to knock anything over. Not even enough to rattle the windows behind me, but enough that my body registered it as a directional vibration. Upward. Whatever was surfacing wasn't shaking the mountain. It was pushing through it. The air thickened again. The stillness from earlier returned, but this time heavier, like a weight pressing down across the treeline. My ears popped. Once, twice. Pressure shift. Sudden, measurable, and local. If this were atmospheric, it would affect the entire tower evenly. But the pressure felt directional, coming from the ridge. I raised the binoculars again, though my hands trembled now, the lenses shaking just enough that I had to brace my elbows against the railing. The dome had grown to a height of about 6 feet above the original ground level. Soil slid down its sides without ever fully exposing whatever shape lay beneath. The earth clung to it, stretching like damp fabric over a rising object. Logical explanations flickered through my mind. Subsurface gas pocket? Impossible at this altitude and geology. Megafauna emergence? No known species burrows at this depth or scale. Man-made structure? There were no facilities here, and even if there were, nothing underground could remain this stable for this long without any record, any access points, any seismic signatures. The dome rose another foot. Another tremor ran through the railing. And then, for the first time tonight, sound arrived. A faint crackle drifted across the valley, subtle but sharp, like distant ice fracturing under stress. It didn't come from the dome itself, but from the treeline immediately above it. Branches trembling, roots shifting. The forest was adjusting to a new, unnatural shape pressing beneath it. I exhaled slowly. Then the radio turned on by itself. Not loudly, not with static. Just a soft click of activation, followed by that same thin hiss I'd heard earlier. except this time it pulsed. A low oscillation, rising and falling every 2 seconds, perfectly timed. Not random, not interference, patterned. My skin prickled from the base of my neck down my arms. I stepped inside the cabin and approached the radio cautiously, as if expecting it to shift or move again. The indicator light wasn't flashing. It glowed steady green, which meant it was transmitting, but the transmit button wasn't pressed. "Dispatch," I said quietly. The hiss pulsed again, matching the exact rhythm from before. 2 seconds up, 2 seconds down, like some mechanical lung operating just beneath the audible range. I hovered my hand over the radio but didn't touch it. "Dispatch, do you copy?" I tried again, and the moment my voice hit the air, the hiss cut off completely. Silence. My breath felt loud in the room. Too loud. I stepped back onto the catwalk, leaving the radio behind like it was something alive that I'd startled. The dome was higher, maybe 9 feet now. The soil at the very top had thinned to a point where I could see the shape more clearly beneath it. Not a smooth sphere, something more angular. Geometric. The earth stretched over flat plains and hard edges, softening their outline but not enough to disguise the artificial symmetry. Corners, lines, angles, a structure, something buried, something rising. I scanned lower, trailing along the edge of the growing depression. The circular ring around the dome had deepened, creating a clear boundary, like the earth had been cut in a perfect circle and the center was being lifted separately from the rest. No seismic activity could create something that precise. No natural process could draw such a clean perimeter. A sound cracked across the slope again, louder this time, a sharp pop followed by the soft roar of shifting soil. A tree at the edge of the depression tilted sharply, its roots pulling upward as the ground beneath it rose a full foot. The entire trunk swayed unnaturally, like it was suspended. The tree didn't fall. It hung there, balanced, supported by nothing visible. My mouth went dry. I lowered the binoculars and stared with bare eyes, needing to confirm what I was seeing wasn't a magnified illusion. But even without lenses, the tree still hovered at an angle that gravity should have rejected. That was when the pressure changed again. A powerful wave pressed against my ears, like being underwater and suddenly rising too fast. My vision blurred for a second. I braced myself on the railing as the pressure expanded outward from the ridge in a slow ripple. And then, finally, sound erupted from the earth. A low, resonant groan rumbled across the valley, vibrating through my bones. It was the sound of enormous strain, metal or rock or something rigid shifting under impossible weight. The dome rose another few inches as the groan intensified. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak into the empty air. "This is not seismic." The words shocked me. Saying them out loud made everything real in a way my thoughts hadn't. I forced myself to retreat into the cabin and grabbed the field phone, the old wired line that predates all our radio systems. It rarely works anymore, but in emergencies you try everything. I cranked the handle, waited for a tone, cranked again. Nothing. Not even static. Just dead, heavy silence. I turned back toward the window. The dome had breached the surface. A thin line of exposed material appeared at the peak, smooth, dark, and reflective under the faint starlight. Not metal, not stone. Something in between. Something manufactured but aged, like an industrial alloy left underground for decades. The earth clung to it desperately, stretching upward in strands before breaking and sliding down its sides. The dome beneath was nearly uncovered, and then the entire surface of the structure vibrated. A single deep tremor, not a movement of ascent, a movement of awakening. I whispered without meaning to, "What the hell is buried under this mountain?" The forest didn't answer, But beneath the soil, something did. The dome vibrated again, twice, evenly spaced, responding. The second vibration rolled through the dome with a deeper resonance than the first, like whatever lay beneath the earth was testing its own structure after a long, silent dormancy. The surface shimmered faintly as soil sloughed away in thin sheets, revealing more of the dark, angled plane underneath. Sharp edges emerged from the dirt, too sharp to be natural, too perfect to belong to anything that had ever grown or eroded on this mountain. Fear wasn't the right word anymore. Fear implies something has already presented itself as a threat. What I felt now was anticipation. The kind that comes when you hear a door unlocking in a house you thought was empty. I didn't step back inside the tower this time. I stayed on the catwalk, breath visible in the cold air, watching as the soil continued to fall away. The dome rose another inch, then another. The groaning sound beneath the ground strengthened, gaining texture, like deep mechanical components grinding softly into motion. It was gentle but constant, methodical. Then I noticed something I should have seen earlier. The depression around the structure wasn't just a collapse ring. It was a boundary with a consistent radius. A perfect circle, the kind you'd expect from excavation, not geological formation. I scanned the perimeter through the binoculars again. The ground didn't crumble randomly outward, it had separated cleanly, like the soil had been deliberately cut and lifted. Had something been buried here? No, buried wasn't the right word. Placed. My throat tightened. I tried to swallow, but the air felt thick again. I turned to check the air pressure gauge inside the cabin. It was dropping, not fast, but steadily. No storm buildup, no humidity shift, just a subtle, unnatural lowering of atmospheric pressure centered around this ridge. I stepped back out, gripping the railing. The dark material of the dome caught a faint glint of starlight, reflecting a sheen that looked almost wet but wasn't. It had a texture, flat but not smooth, like matte metal designed to absorb glare. The angles beneath the dirt formed a polygonal shape, though I couldn't tell how many sides yet. 6? 8? More? The sound changed again. Not a groan this time. A click. A soft, sharp, deliberate click echoing faintly across the valley. It repeated once. Then once more. 3 total. Evenly spaced. Mechanical. Patterned. My heartbeat jumped in my chest. I froze, not blinking, not breathing. Because clicks like that weren't geological, weren't biological, weren't anything this mountain had ever made in my years up here. They were engineered. The structure wasn't just surfacing. It was unlocking. The soil at the very top suddenly cracked open in a thin, perfectly straight line. A seam, not an organic fissure. A manufactured seam dividing the surface into 2 symmetrical halves. Dust lifted around the seam, rising in a straight vertical plume before dissipating into the night. I whispered, almost pleading, "No, no, this isn't real." But it was. It was happening in front of me. Slowly, methodically, the seam widened. The line spread outward by a fraction of an inch, then again a second later. The halves began to separate, just slightly. Just enough for me to see the faintest shadow between them, thin, dark, impossibly straight. Inside the tower, the radio clicked on again. I spun toward it. The indicator light glowed red this time, transmitting. But the button still wasn't pressed. A low hum filled the cabin, rising in pitch until it matched the frequency of the vibrations coming from the dome below. I didn't want to approach it, but I did. "What do you want?" I whispered. The radio responded with a burst of static. Not random, not chaotic. It stuttered in a precise rhythm, short, short, long, short, short, long. A repeating cadence. Pattern. A signal. A code. My brain scrambled to keep up. Could it be Morse? No. Too slow. too evenly spaced. Possibly telemetry interference? Maybe. But telemetry for what? There were no active research stations within 50 miles. No mining operations. No underground facilities. Nothing that would broadcast in this pattern. I stepped away from the radio, shutting the cabin door behind me because I couldn't stand the sound anymore. My hands were shaking, but my legs carried me automatically to the railing. The dome had stopped rising. It held completely still. The symmetry of the shape was clearer now, a hexagon, clean and precise, with edges so straight they felt out of place in the natural world. The two halves at the top continued to separate, widening the seam inch by inch. Soil slid down the sides in steady cascades as the divide grew. The air pressure shifted again. This time fast. My ears popped sharply. I gasped as the pressure dropped another full millibar in seconds. A breeze swept across the catwalk, thin, cold, and directed straight from the ridge. Not outward, not expanding, inward, like the air was being drawn toward the opening structure. A suction. I gripped the railing hard enough that my fingers ached. The seam widened further until the gap was nearly a foot across. I expected light, or heat, or vapor, something escaping from the interior. But nothing emerged. Only darkness. A darkness darker than the night outside it. Not glowing, not shifting, just deep, matte absence. Another click echoed from within the dome, and the two halves began to tilt outward. Slowly, deliberately, like a hatch opening. My breath caught. My chest tightened. The cold around me suddenly felt warmer compared to the chill rolling out from that opening. An icy wave drifting up toward the tower in slow, measured pulses. I whispered into the wind, "If someone is down there, you need to respond." Nothing answered, but the hatch kept opening. When the halves angled far enough that I could see deeper into the structure, my stomach dropped. There were no lights, no machinery, no tunnels, just depth, a vertical shaft descending into blackness. A shaft that had no business existing beneath this mountain. The radio inside the cabin clicked 3 times in perfect sync. Click, click, click. The hatch stopped opening, and the mountain went silent again. Not natural silence. Waiting silence. The waiting silence was worse than the sound. Worse than the groaning earth. Worse than the clicking radio. Worse than the hatch opening like a mouth in the soil. Silence meant intention. Silence meant whatever was beneath the mountain had paused. Not because it was done, but because it was listening. I forced myself to inhale. The air had a faint metallic taste now, almost like breathing near a cold battery, thin and sharp at the edges. I swallowed, trying to clear it, but it lingered on my tongue. The breeze pulled toward the open shaft again, dragging the loose ends of my jacket inward as though the valley exhaled gently and the structure inhaled. I didn't realize I'd backed away from the railing until my shoulder hit the cabin door. I pushed inside instinctively, needing a barrier between myself and the thing on the ridge. The radio was still glowing red. The hum continued, steady and unwavering. I reached out and unplugged the radio entirely. The hum didn't stop. My hand froze on the cord. The radio was dead in my hand. No power, no connection, no function. But the hum came from deeper inside the cabin, vibrating through the wood and metal around me like the tower itself had become a tuning fork. I set the powerless radio down slowly, as if dropping it might provoke something. The hum deepened. Another pressure shift rolled through the room, popping both ears simultaneously. My vision blurred for half a second, enough that I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. When my sight cleared, I realized the lantern hanging near the window was swaying slightly. Not from wind, but from a vibration traveling upward from the ground. Something was rising again. I stepped to the window with slow, careful movements, like creeping toward a wild animal I didn't want to startle. Through the glass, the ridge sat under the growing moonlight, still and dark. But the hatch was open wider now, the two metal-like panels fully splayed outward like the petals of a mechanical flower. The shaft was deeper than I'd realized. Much deeper. My spotlight beam from earlier hadn't reached its bottom. Still didn't. Even with the faint moonlight shining directly above it now, the interior remained pure black. Not just unlit, absorbing. I unlocked the window, pushed it open, and stepped back onto the catwalk because if something else was moving inside that shaft, I needed to see it directly. The railing was cold under my hand, colder than the night air, the chill biting enough that I flinched. Then came the sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping rising from inside the shaft. Not clicking, tapping. Light, hollow, and spaced far apart. Tap, 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 like fingers testing the inside of a wall. Each tap echoed faintly up the valley, not loud, but focused, directed, like it was meant for the tower. I tightened my grip on the railing, every muscle in my arms stiffening. The tapping grew slightly louder, still rhythmic, still slow. My chest tightened with a pressure that didn't come from the altitude. Tap, tap, tap. Then the rhythm changed. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, 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 pause. Tap. Patterns again. Structured. Communicative. I licked my lips. They tasted like coins now, metallic and dry. A rational explanation, any rational explanation, would have steadied me. Machinery left from a forgotten survey project? Unlikely. Military installation? Impossible. This is protected land. No record of acquisition or underground activity. Active wildlife? No known animal creates a pattern like that. Geological resonance? Rocks don't tap in sequence. But still, I forced myself to think through practical possibilities. Survival instinct wants order, predictability, labels, and I needed something to label this before panic filled the gaps. I raised the binoculars again, though my hands were shaking now badly enough that I had to brace my elbow on the railing. As I focused on the lip of the open hatch, I saw it, the soil at the edges vibrating in tiny pulses. Something inside was moving upward. Not the structure. Something inside it. I leaned forward despite every instinct telling me to step back. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was instantaneous, like a switch had been flipped. Even the wind held still. Then I heard breathing. Not human breathing. Not animal breathing. A long, slow pull of air from deep within the shaft. The same suction-like sound that had been tugging at the treetops earlier, but now sharper, more deliberate. It didn't stop. It grew stronger, pulling harder against the valley air. I felt it physically. My jacket tightened against my body as the breeze pulled toward the ridge. My hair shifted in the same direction. Even the dust on the catwalk swirled into a thin stream flowing toward the open hatch. Pressure drop. Significant. My ears popped again, harder than before. I winced and gripped the railing with both hands, leaning forward involuntarily. The suction stopped abruptly. The valley fell silent. Then something exhaled. A slow, deep outward breath rolled up the mountain and washed over the tower like a wave of cold fog. It wasn't moisture, I checked. My skin didn't cling or dampen. But the temperature fell sharply, and the air carried a faint vibration, so faint it could have been imagined. But I didn't imagine it. I felt it. "What are you?" I whispered. My voice evaporated in the cold air. The tree-line near the ridge shook slightly, branches quivering not from wind, but from a pressure wave rolling through the forest. The ground around the depression shifted again, one slow pulsation like something massive adjusting just beneath the soil. Then I heard it. Metal. A deep grinding scrape coming from the hatch, as if something heavy inside the shaft were beginning to rise. The noise echoed, layering with itself, bouncing through the hollow interior in long metallic resonances. I stepped back, not because I wanted distance, because my legs were moving on their own. My back hit the tower wall. My breath trembled out of me. The grinding grew louder, smoother, steadier, like an elevator, a deep, heavy elevator rising up through a chamber no one had ever built. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I stepped inside the cabin and shut the door quietly. Then I locked it, not because a lock could stop anything that could move a mountain, but because humans do stupid little things to feel safe when safety is already gone. The grinding continued, drawing closer. Something was coming up the shaft. Something real. Something mechanical. Something that had been asleep under the mountain for a very, very long time. The grinding rose through the shaft at a steady pace, slow enough that I could count the intervals between every shift in metal. 3 seconds of resonance, 1 second of silence. 3 seconds of resonance, 1 silence. Pattern, precise, engineered. I backed away from the door without realizing it, my legs moving until the back of my knees hit the cot behind me. I didn't sit, I couldn't. My body hung there halfway, tense, listening. The tower's floorboards vibrated faintly with each deep mechanical groan climbing up from the ridge. Not enough to shake anything loose, not enough to rattle the lanterns, but enough for my bones to feel the rhythm. Something was rising inside that shaft, not rushing, not forcing its way through, ascending calmly, deliberately, like it was following instructions written decades before any of us ever set foot on this mountain. I moved toward the window again, pulled back the curtain an inch and looked out. The hatch was fully open. The soil along its edges had fallen completely away, revealing a perfect hexagonal frame made of that same dark, non-reflective metal. The interior walls of the shaft were vertical and smooth, like the inside of a massive elevator tunnel. Then I saw movement, a faint suggestion of shape deep inside the shaft. Indistinct, dark, ascending with slow certainty. I pressed the binoculars to my eyes, adjusting the focus carefully, my breath loud in my ears. The shape was still too far down to understand clearly, but I saw structure. Straight lines, symmetry, hard geometry rising upward in the darkness. Machinery. This wasn't rock. This wasn't debris. This wasn't an animal or a geological event. It was a machine, and it was enormous. The grinding grew louder as it neared the surface, the resonance deeper now, vibrating the glass of the window. I stepped back instinctively, the binoculars lowering from my hands. My palms were damp. I wiped them against my jeans, trying to steady my breathing. Another pressure wave rolled through the tower, subtle but undeniable. My ears popped again. The air felt lighter, almost thinning, as if the interior of the shaft were generating some kind of vacuum or displacement as the structure neared the surface. I couldn't stay inside. I didn't want to be outside either, but staying behind glass made me feel trapped. I unlocked the door with hands that didn't feel like they belonged to me and stepped onto the catwalk again. The cold hit me instantly, sharper and more metallic than before. My breath fogged in front of me in quick bursts. The treetops along the ridge began to sway, not from wind, but from vibrations pushing up through the ground. The forest reacted like water disturbed by something large rising beneath the surface. I raised the binoculars again. The shape in the shaft grew clearer. At first I thought it was a column, tall, solid, maybe part of a larger support structure. But as it rose higher, new lines emerged. Angled plating, interlocking panels, a central vertical spine surrounded by mechanisms that shifted gently as the structure ascended, like components adjusting to maintain balance. The machine was rising on its own, powered from within, controlled by a system still functioning after who knows how long underground. My mouth went dry. Below the mechanism, Faint puffs of dust lifted from the shaft, rising like smoke from a long-sealed chamber being disturbed. The air shimmered slightly above the opening. Not heat, not cold, but a distortion, like differences in air density rippling upward. The machine rose another meter. Its surface was the same matte metal as the hatch, but with markings, lines etched into the plating in precise, symmetrical patterns. Not letters, not symbols, more like contour lines on a map, but arranged with perfect mathematical spacing. The grinding softened to a slower pace. Another pressure wave passed through me, and then everything stopped. The machine halted just below the surface, its top edge perfectly aligned with the rim of the hexagonal opening. The timing was too precise to be accidental. It stopped exactly where it meant to. Silence washed over the valley. Real silence this time, not waiting, not listening, not pressure-induced. Just a sudden, complete cessation of all sound. Even the insects that had dared to return a few minutes earlier fell quiet again. I held my breath without meaning to. Then, a small panel on the side of the machine shifted. Not much, just enough for a thin vent-like slit to appear. Air hissed outward, soft, steady, controlled. A release of internal pressure. Not violent, not malfunctioning, purposeful exhale. I lowered the binoculars slowly. The machine wasn't just rising. It was preparing. Preparing for what? My fingers curled around the railing so tight it hurt. A faint indicator light, barely visible from this distance, blinked once on the machine's surface. A small, steady pulse of white. Then another. Then another. Not random. 3 blinks. A pause. 3 blinks again. The same pattern the radio had echoed earlier. My knees nearly buckled. The machine blinked again. 3 pulses. A pause. Inside the tower, the powerless radio clicked once. Then twice. Then 3 times. Perfect sync. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sweat formed along my hairline despite the cold. I wiped it away with a shaky hand. Whatever this machine was, it recognized the tower. Or it recognized me. Because right as the radio finished its 3rd click, the machine responded. Its uppermost panel rotated, smoothly, silently, revealing a dark interior recess. A compartment, a chamber, a window. I leaned forward despite everything screaming at me not to. Inside that recess, something shifted. Not machinery, not a light, a shape, a silhouette, a figure, tall, motionless, standing inside the ascending structure. And then, it moved, just slightly, enough to turn its head upward, enough to look directly at me. The figure didn't move again after that first small shift. It simply held its gaze, or whatever approximation of a gaze it had, locked on me. At this distance, even with the binoculars, I couldn't make out details. The interior of the machine's compartment was too dark, the angles too deep. But I could see the silhouette clearly enough to know it was upright, humanoid in form, and very still. Not a shadow, not a reflection. Something standing inside a machine rising out of a mountain. My pulse thudded so hard the binoculars shook. I lowered them slowly, afraid that any sudden motion might somehow trigger a response. The cold air pressed around me, heavy with static I could almost taste. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stay at the railing. "Don't move," I whispered to myself. Not to it, to myself. But the figure didn't move anyway. It stood in that slot-like recess, motionless except for the subtle suggestion of breath. If it even breathed. I couldn't see a chest or limbs or a head clearly. Only the outline of something upright, framed perfectly by the angled compartment of the rising machine. A tremor shivered through the catwalk under my feet. Not strong, just enough to make the metal railing hum softly. The machine was shifting again. not rising but settling into place, adjusting its weight. The grinding resumed for a brief moment, quieter than before, as though internal mechanisms were aligning themselves after a long dormant cycle. Then the machine stopped moving entirely, but the figure remained. Watching, I stepped backward until my shoulders met the cabin door again. My hand found the doorknob without looking, but I didn't open it. I couldn't tear my eyes from the ridge. Every instinct screamed that turning away would be the mistake that ended everything. A breeze rolled across the valley. Finally, actual wind. But it wasn't gentle. It moved with a strange directionality, swirling around the machine before funneling upward toward me, carrying with it a cold so sharp it felt like a blade dragging along my jawline. The figure didn't react. It didn't brace. It didn't shift. It absorbed the wind like it wasn't even there. Then the radio inside the cabin clicked once. Just once. Not the 3-click pattern. One click. A single acknowledgement. The figure moved. Barely. A tilt, its head angling slightly to the left, like it was listening to the radio's response. The motion was slow, controlled, devoid of hesitation. Then it tilted back, resuming its original posture, perfectly aligned with the compartment. I whispered, "No," not to deny it, just because my mind couldn't form anything else. I forced myself to move, inch by inch, into the cabin, keeping my gaze on the ridge as I opened the door just wide enough to slip inside. The radio sat on the desk, powerless, disconnected from the outlet. But the moment I stepped toward it, the indicator light blinked once. White, soft, steady, matching the machine's signal. My stomach dropped. I reached toward the radio as though approaching a venomous animal. My finger hovered above the speaker grill. The radio clicked again, one single click, crisp and intentional. Then, for the first time all night, a sound emerged from the speaker that wasn't static. It was faint, thin, a soft, airy vibration, like someone exhaling through a hollow tube from very far away. I jerked my hand back. The sound stopped immediately, mid-exhale. Silence. I didn't want to look out the window again. I didn't want to know if the figure had moved closer or disappeared. But not looking was worse. Not knowing was worse. I approached the window slowly, every step a heavy, deliberate command I issued to my own body. I pushed aside the curtain with a shaking hand. The figure hadn't moved, but it had changed. Its silhouette now filled more of the compartment. It hadn't leaned forward. It hadn't stepped out. It had simply become clearer, as though the light or lack of it had shifted inside the machine, revealing more structure. I could now see a shoulder, a ridge of what looked like armor or plating, a straight, angular line running from the top of its head down its back. No facial features, no skin, no seams in the plating, a shape too symmetrical to be human, too intentional to be geological, too still to be alive, too precise not to be designed. The figure lifted an arm, just slightly, a slow rise, deliberate, no hesitation. I stumbled back from the window, nearly knocking over the chair behind me. The arm didn't complete the motion. It paused halfway, held there, as if waiting. My breathing went shallow. 2 seconds passed. 3, 4. Then the machine responded. A deep, resonant thrum rolled through its structure like a sub-bass note felt more than heard. The sound vibrated across the valley, rattling the tower windows in their frames. The figure lowered its arm slowly, returning to its initial position. And then, for the first time, it stepped forward. Not out of the machine, not up the shaft, but forward inside the compartment, closing the small gap between itself and the edge of the opening. My heart seized. It was taller than I'd realized. Its head nearly grazed the top of the compartment. Its body moved with controlled hydraulics, each shift smooth and airtight like a pressurized servo. It leaned closer to the opening. Closer. It wasn't coming out. It was observing me. My hands were shaking so violently I had to hold my wrists with the other hand to keep steady. The figure tilted its head again. Then, from inside the machine, a new sound arose. One I hadn't heard before. A mechanical sorting noise. The rhythmic shifting of internal parts resetting. Like a system cycling through old archived functions. Then a second noise, a low, repeating tone, almost like sonar but far slower. The radio blinked white again. The machine pulsed white again. And then the figure lifted its other arm. Straight up. A full extension. Not threatening. Signaling. And the mountain, for the first time tonight, answered with movement. Something beneath the ground shifted again. Large. Deliberate. Not rising this time. Approaching. The ground beneath the ridge shifted with a force that didn't shake the mountain. It reshaped it. Not a quake. Not a slide. A controlled movement. Like an unseen platform adjusting itself beneath tons of earth. The treeline around the depression trembled as the soil beneath it settled into a new configuration. The trees didn't fall. They didn't even crack. They simply moved with the terrain, bending a few degrees and then freezing in their new angle. The figure in the machine remained motionless, arm raised, head angled toward me. Not threatening, not beckoning. A posture of acknowledgement, like it had signaled something and was now waiting for a return signal. The machine's internal tone continued its slow, sonar-like pulse. Each beat rolled through the shaft, across the valley floor, and up the tower legs into my bones. A deep thrum sounded again from the mountain. Not from the machine, lower, broader, like a second structure beneath the first, responding with its own mechanical voice. The ground vibrated in a wide circle around the ridge, the soil shifting in coordinated pulses that formed absolutely consistent intervals. Two structures were talking to each other. My breath came out in a thin, uneven stream. I stepped backward from the window, my heel catching on the edge of a crate. I didn't fall, but I had to grab the table to steady myself. My hands were soaked with sweat despite the cold. "What is this? What is this?" I kept whispering because saying nothing felt worse. The radio clicked on again. One click, then another, then a third. No static this time, no hiss, just 3 clean clicks. The exact pattern of the machine's blinking signals. I picked up the radio with trembling hands. It was ice cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer instead of a warm cabin. I brought it to my ear, waiting for something, anything. A low tone hummed from the speaker. Not a voice, not language, a pure frequency, almost perfect in pitch, rising and falling with the same rhythm that echoed from the machine on the ridge. My body reacted instinctively. I pulled the radio away from my ear, stepping back like someone had just leaned too close to whisper something I wasn't ready to hear. The tone stopped. Then a faint, metallic knock sounded through the radio speaker. Not the machine, not the structure beneath. This knock was softer, more hollow. Inside the radio, my throat tightened. I set it down on the desk and backed away. Outside, the figure lowered its arm. A new sound followed immediately, like internal clamps unlocking inside the mountain. The ridge surface bulged in a perfect circular ring around the depression, soil heaving upward from below as though a massive structure beneath the earth were adjusting its orientation. The figure stepped back inside the compartment, not retreating, but repositioning itself. The internal walls of the machine shifted too. Panels rotated. Lines of faint white light pulsed along the edges, all in sync with the sonar-like signal. I raised the binoculars again even though my hands shook so badly the lenses jittered. I forced them steady and focused on the figure. This time I saw its face, or what should have been a face. There were no eyes, No mouth, no human features at all. Just a smooth, angular plate that tapered slightly where a head should narrow, with faint intersecting lines running like etched pathways across its surface. Not organic, not expressive, constructed. The figure lifted its head toward the sky. The sky responded. A pressure shift swept up the mountain. The clouds above the valley stretched outward in a slow ring shape, like something above the cloud layer was pulling the atmosphere into a vortex. It wasn't violent. No wind slammed into the tower, no turbulence, but the shape formed regardless. Perfect, expanding circle. My breath caught. This wasn't random. This wasn't geological. This wasn't atmospheric. This was coordinated actions above and below the mountain responding to the machine. The tower creaked under me. Not violently, just a long, low bend like it was bowing with the shifting air. I gripped the railing for balance. On the ridge, the ground bulged again. Then it opened. Not explosively, not chaotically. A controlled release as a massive circular section of soil lifted from beneath on hidden supports, rising slowly into the air. The trees on top of it rode the lift as though standing on an elevator platform the size of a field. Underneath the rising plate, something vast and angular glinted in the moonlight. Metal, a structure larger than the one already surfaced. Layered, geometric, impossible. The machine with the figure inside had not emerged alone. It was part of something far bigger, something designed with mathematical precision, buried deep beneath this mountain long before any ranger tower existed, long before any trails were carved, long before any maps were drawn. My vision blurred for a second. I blinked hard until the scene refocused. The figure turned its head back toward me. The radio clicked once, and then, for the first time, a voice came through. Not human, not synthetic, not a malfunction. A simple, low vibration translated into something that barely qualified as speech. Stand by. My knees almost buckled. The figure raised its arm again. The larger structure beneath the mountain pulsed with white light. The valley exhaled a long, cold breath up the mountainside, sweeping through the trees, across the ridge, and directly into the tower. I stumbled back into the cabin, slammed the door shut, and dropped to my knees, breath shaking out of me in hard, uneven bursts. I didn't know if the message was meant for me. I didn't know if the machine recognized the tower as a relay. I didn't know if the figures were emerging or if this was just a test cycle, a system reboot after centuries of dormancy. But I understood one thing with absolute clarity. The mountain hadn't changed tonight. It had awakened, and whatever lay beneath it wasn't finished rising.